question from Michelle, and she's concerned about gluten intolerance and gluten sensitivity, and she's wondering what the diet is one must go on if so. There are many debates out there, she says. If one is intolerant to gluten, must they avoid all grains or just the basic wheat, rye, barley and oats? There's a lot of debate about gluten. You'll find many restaurants that are actually serving foods that are void of gluten, and because many people have outright gluten allergies, and they and that can be very, very dangerous for them. Then there's the celiac disease, which is sort of a chronic inflammatory disease related to gluten. So if a person eats gluten, it can cause severe gastrointestinal distress and in fact cause damage to the brain. So if you have a gluten intolerance or sensitivity, I would recommend that for the time being you do avoid foods that contain gluten, and of course wheat, rye, barley and oats contain them. Oats to a lesser degree, unless of course it is manufactured in a place that also manufactures wheat. So it's not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily naturally contain gluten. So if you find a source of oats that don't contain gluten, then that would be the way to go with regard to oatmeal that you could eat for breakfast. With regard to bread and other baked goods that contain a lot of gluten, the reason why there is such a huge gluten intolerance is because the flour that's being used and has been used for many years now with raising agents and particular preservatives and enhancing agents, these ingredients, they have actually denatured the wheat flour and caused a lot of problems. The problems are basically that when wheat is baked, turned into breads, that's when the gluten that would normally, if normal healthy wheat flour would be used, it would go through a process of fermentation, and the fermentation would get rid of most of the gluten, and this would make the bread fit for human consumption. But what has happened over so many years is that we created shortcuts in the baking process. Now you can bake a loaf of bread in a matter of an hour or two, and then give it and use it as food. The problem with that is that yeast is being used, and yeast is a raising agent, fermenting agent that accelerates this process, but it does not break down the gluten sufficiently to the point that it wouldn't cause any harm. So there is so much gluten nowadays in the breads that it's surprising that there are still some people around that don't have a gluten intolerance. I personally had a gluten intolerance, severe gluten intolerance, that would give me actually diarrhea, and I used one of my own processes called sacred sanctimony that would clear up the gluten intolerance within a matter of 3 minutes of doing that. But typically I don't know of any other method to get rid of a gluten allergy, particularly that quickly, except by not eating gluten-rich foods, and then gradually eating foods that have low gluten content and then going to foods that are, let's say if you do eat bread, you eat bread that has been properly processed with unadulterated flour that has been properly baked into breads, and that typically takes about 2 or 3 days time, not using any yeast at all. So yeast can inhibit the breakdown of gluten and should be avoided. So once you have been gluten-free for a while, you can start reintroducing gluten little by little and see if that works for you. Besides that, cleansing the liver often gets rid of gluten intolerance or any kind of allergy. So I've seen many people who cleaned out their liver completely. They had no more allergies, where they used to have gluten intolerance or gluten allergy or other allergies, which simply disappeared as the liver was basically starting from scratch, starting on a clean slate, being so efficient that it can deal with contaminants or you break down proteins into harmless substances, amino acids, without creating a strong reaction against it. Having said that, it's best to, for the time being, look for foods that don't give you the allergic reaction, and then you reintroduce foods that have some gluten in it, so that you're not completely losing the immunity that you require in order to live in this world and interact with foods that you eat.